Greetings, everybody. This is Christopher Messina coming at you from the Messy Time Studios. It is a beautiful day here in Florida, January 25th, 2022. And I'm delighted to have visiting us from Hong Kong in the studio, James Fok, who has written a phenomenal book, Financial Cold War, A View of Sino-US Relations from the Financial Markets. Now, for those of us who are policy wonks and unrepentant investment bankers, it is an immediately gripping title and a very fascinating treatment that he has given to the topic. So James, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
It's a bright sunny day there as we're coming into the nighttime here in Florida, and just love that you wrote this. Right, it is incredibly timely. You know, so many people, in my experience, I do a lot in national security. They go on and on from a security perspective, and a lot of folks in capital markets drone on and on as if trading is the only thing that exists. But I love the fact that having had 20 years of experience across Asia and Europe in the capital markets and exchanges, and then I gathered doing some of the negotiations around mainland China integration with Hong Kong, you've got a good sense of what Adam Smith used to call political economy long before we made up this thing called economics. So, what's the first big headline you got to give someone if you want to tell them in 2 sentences what your book's about?
Look, I mean, the reason why I wrote the book was very simply that I've seen China and the US basically careering towards some conflict for reasons that most people have very little idea of. There are lots of reasons for those, but at least in the financial markets, I felt that I was in a position, having worked in the places that I've worked and done the things that I've done, to explain and articulate those in a way that the honest, intelligent person can understand. And so I think the hope was that by giving people a better explanation, a better understanding of the financial forces that were creating these conflicts and tensions, that we may be able to find some resolutions to them.
And what would you think of if you're introducing this to, say, an educated professional who's not in the financial markets, right? And they say, well, I don't get it. Like, why? I hear things about US dollars reserve currency, and that irritates China. And is that the issue? Like, what are the main things that leapt out at you as you were writing the book that required the most sort of base level explanation for someone who's interested in the topic but doesn't know much?
Look, I mean, I think in the US and in China, most people are just getting on with their lives. They're not thinking about global geopolitics. They're not thinking about the structure of the financial markets. They're just looking to get on with their own lives, try and day by day make their lives a little bit better, and hopefully be able to provide for their children, and hopefully have their children, day by day have improving lives and opportunities. The fundamental problem here is that today we're not seeing that. For a lot of people, in fact, for the majority of people in the US and China, we're seeing life become tougher and tougher. It's becoming harder and harder to provide for yourself. The opportunities for your kids and your family are diminishing relative to what they were. And those have created, understandably, tensions and frustrations. And the unfortunate thing is that as these tensions and frustrations have boiled over, those have ended up in a conflict between the two countries of increasing scale. Some of that is played out in the financial markets, through things like sanctions, things like trade wars and so forth, most of which I think actually make the problem worse rather than better. Probably. And so the book really is an explanation of the sources of these tensions that are spilling over into these conflicts.
So that is absolutely true. That a prosperous economy or prosperous society is a peaceful one, right? On the whole, people don't bother to step out of their day-to-day life to go, either rally in support of the government or put on, balaclava and go, burn down federal buildings if they're happy with things, right? If there's rampant opportunity. If you could wave your magic wand, and we all get to play this game, right? And what if in the capital markets, what would be the main thing that if you could, China and the US would stop bickering about this one item or one issue, would greatly relieve a huge amount of the pressure? Is there such a thing?
Well, I'd say that the biggest problem that they face, or the biggest source of imbalances in the financial system today, is the role of the US dollar. And while that's been for a long time a very useful tool for people working in international trade and international finance, it's fundamentally created a whole load of imbalances which have contributed to this worsening inequality. And it's a really complex problem, because actually there is this belief that the US dollar has been fantastic for the US. It's been a great source of power. It's made it easier and cheaper to borrow, certainly. But what's happened is that because in order to supply the rest of the world with enough dollar liquidity to support growing trade and growing financial investment around the world, the US has basically had to run ever higher levels of balance payments deficits. And when the US economy isn't growing as fast, or at least as fast as the rest of the world, it's meant that the US has gone into higher and higher levels of debt. And effectively, the dollar system can stay irrational for a very long time, certainly longer than you or I can stay solvent. But it's not going to stay. It's not going to stay irrational forever.
Right.
And as the system hits a breaking point, which I believe that if we're not at today, we're very close to, then it's going to spill over into quite significant further problems.
Absolutely. It's one of the things that we debate constantly, because part of what my firm is doing is getting much more heavily involved in cryptocurrencies, but all of them that are backed by physical assets, right? I've been in asset-backed finance for years. It happens to be now tied to a token that to me is just another delivery mechanism and a recording mechanism. Doesn't fundamentally change finance, but that for people who don't understand that sort of how the fiat dollar works, how any fiat currency works, right? The number of Americans, if you just randomly polled, I think that a couple of institutes did randomly in the street, like some startlingly high percentage of Americans believes the dollar is backed by gold still, right? Which hasn't been true since Nixon, but they still believe that. They still believe it is tied to some kind of a different value other than just that the government says so. And when you tell them that, they kind of freak out. But it has worked, as you say, very well. But as we constantly say in the markets, right, it works really well until it doesn't. And so you're seeing competing geopolitical power influences who argue that, well, why can't I keep, if I keep my reserves in euros, pounds, dollars, and yuan, what's so special about the dollar at this point, right? We can denominate things in other prices. Is that potentially where you see the first sort of less damaging, harmless slippage occur, right? You're just going to price things in different amounts now. Does that matter?
Well, the fundamental problem is that as the currency is getting debased, what it's feeding into is higher levels of inflation. Now, we believe that inflation has been low for a very long time, and certainly for the average basket of consumer goods that's measured, that's true. But the debasement of the currency has come with effectively higher and higher levels of asset prices. Unfortunately, what's happened with the COVID-19 pandemic is that because you've had this monetary expansion coupled with a huge supply shock, this is now feeding into levels of inflation that haven't been seen for 40 years.
Yep.
And for a lot of US citizens, and for the majority of the middle class who have been struggling to get by through periods where they haven't had huge amounts of real wage increases and have been going into greater levels of debt to finance their lifestyles, this increase in consumer prices, the average price of your basket of groceries every week, is starting to create serious social tensions.
Yep.
And I think that's unsustainable. That the US is in a really difficult position now because the Fed balance sheet has been expanded to extent, and the government debt has been expanded to such an extent that you're trapped basically between a rock and a hard place, because when you increase interest rates to combat inflation, actually it's going to make that problem of the budget worse. So in any typical market economy, I mean, the natural way of adjusting that is for the currency to take the heat and devalue. And when the currency devalues, that makes your goods and your manufacturers more competitive. You're able to export more, and the system is able to rebalance. But the problem with the dollar system is that because you've had this international demand for dollars to support the global financial system and the global trading system, the dollar has been unable to structurally adjust to the new economic realities. And so the loss of competitiveness for US businesses has persisted. And this has been costing people their jobs, their livelihoods. And these are things that are at the heart of a lot of the political conflicts, both in the US today, but also the conflicts that you're seeing between the US and China and between other countries as well.
Broadly speaking, to look at that issue of dollar devaluation and how that knock-on effect ripples throughout both domestically and internationally, is there a sort of preferred Chinese policy stance where they would like to say, America, you should do X vis-a-vis the US dollar, that would be good for us, but we also think more broadly that would relieve some of the pressure and some of these tensions? Do they have a coherently expressed strategy for what they would like to see the dollar do?
They've hinted at it in places, and the first place where that was hinted very strongly at was at a speech given by the former governor of the People's Bank of China back in 2009, where he suggested an expansion in the use of the IMF's SDRs as the global reserve currency. Now, actually, that's not a hugely outlandish idea. That was, in fact, one of the two proposals that was tabled at Bretton Woods in 1944, when the dollar system was actually created. And actually, had that system been created using not a single national currency, but either a basket of other currencies or a new, effectively neutral international currency, we may not have seen many of the problems that we're seeing today.
Very briefly, for those of my listeners who are unaware, the SDR James referred to as a special drawing right, which is this kind of quasi-currency that the IMF denominates its books in, and then translates into various currencies as it distributes aid around the world. But sorry for the interruption.
But I think that there's a belief that, which I believe is untrue, that China is trying to turn the renminbi into the global reserve currency and to use up the dollar's position. And in fact, I mean that's one of the points of tension in the minds of many policymakers in the US today. And actually, my own experience and conversations suggest that actually that is really something that the Chinese aren't particularly interested in, mainly because they've seen what it's cost the US to have the dollar serve this global utility role. Now, whether IMF SCRs are the best alternative to dollars, that's a big question mark. There are pros and cons to that.
Very big.
I think that there needs to be a sensible debate over what the structure of the global monetary system should look like, and a sensible path mapped out for the world to move towards that set of reforms that would create that. It
forms a lot of very serious debate here. In fact, there are a few senators and policymakers here who have called for the abolishing the Fed. Right, their argument is, it's an absurd anachronism. It was created to serve a bunch of banks. It has served a bunch of banks. It's a lot of the people involved in this, certainly the politicians, at least in America, they get to control this debate because it's complex, it's abstruse. They try to make it sound both as complicated and as boring as possible instantly, so people switch off and watch a football game, right? But trying to explain how money is created, when you explain to people, not only is it not backed by gold anymore, but that when the Treasury issues debt, since the crash of 07, 08, 30 to 90 to 100% sometimes of the bidders showing up at the Treasury auction is the Fed. So it's literally, if you were a household taking money out of your right pocket and put it in your left, and the looks I get on people's faces when I explain that, startling, like just startling. So it has managed to stay afloat through sheer inertia, I would argue, at this point. So the Chinese are probably right if they're looking for a planned off-ramp to a more rational multi-currency system before something calamitous happens, which when it happens, everyone's going to look back at hindsight. It's going to look obvious. But right now, we're not quite sure what that breakdown would look like.
Well, I think that's the key point. I mean, the problems are big, they're complicated, mind-boggling. In fact, the complexity of them. But ultimately, no country is going to be able to solve them on their own. And you referred to this issue. You referred to this issue of over dependence on monetary policy, and the flip side of that, and I'm sure you remember back to Econ 101, was that there are really two tools to control the supply of money in the economy. One is monetary policy, and the other is fiscal policy. And if the government's living beyond its means, then it needs to tighten its belt, and that's painful sometimes. But equally, in order to be able to do that, it needs to make the tax system fair and progressive. And I think one of the big problems, and you and I have both seen it in the organizations that we've come from and the worlds that we've lived in, that the tax systems is often the case that tax systems are incredibly unfair, in that the wealthy are paying far lower rates of tax than average middle class workers, simply because you've had the backdrop of this global fiscal competition where each country is trying to attract investment to themselves. And it's a lot easier for money to cross border than for people to cross borders. So effectively, it's been a lot easier to tax your workers than to tax earnings on capital.
Yep.
And so this has created, frankly, tax systems that have been insufficient to serve the needs of the country because they just simply haven't been able to tax enough, and more unfair and inegalitarian tax systems where the people who are the best off are paying far lower rates of tax or making far lower contributions into the system than average workers. And so one of the good things that the new administration in the US has pushed for is some global minimum standards with the G7 agreement on global minimum corporate tax rates. Now, there are a lot of flaws in what's been implemented, and frankly, the system needs a lot more to give it teeth.
Yes, it's a big mess right now.
It is a big mess, but I think that fundamentally, you can't have some countries running tax regimes that are fundamentally undermining the sovereignty and the ability for other countries to raise tax revenues, which is effectively what's been happening. So these are problems that cannot be solved by any country on their own, and ultimately everyone needs to sit down in a room like a grown-up or like a set of grown-ups and work out a way forward. And this is what I think China and America, as the two biggest economies, the greatest powers in the world, now need to do.
It reminded me, you're absolutely right in terms of, it would be tremendous for adults to sit down in a room and have a rational discussion. As you were saying it, I was reminded of a good friend of mine who was interviewing me for something entirely else. And I was talking about, ideally, it was about a state government, ideally, if we could do X, Y, and Z and make everything work. And he stopped and he left. He said, "Christopher, have you been drinking?" Right. So the main headache is that very rarely, in my experience anyway, very rarely is there a mix of effective politician who gets him or herself into power combined with Plato's, thoughtful philosopher king, who's got an indifferent and balanced and intelligent, reasonable approach to policy. So you get a lot of hodgepodge, right? We would all love to believe the best people possible are put forward into these situations, and we all know sometimes yes, sometimes no. And so it's tricky, as we're seeing now with this tax idea, right? That very same concept, you looked at it here in the United States. Well, a lot of other states get very angry at Florida and Texas because we have no state income tax. We live within our means. We have other taxes. We tax people who come to Disney. We tax offshore oil. Like, there are taxes that fuel the government, but there's no income tax. So that's very attractive to people. And Florida and Texas' argument would be, well, you all have insanely high bloated budgets. You don't need them. If you did the same thing we did, you wouldn't be losing people to us the same way that countries are arguing too. So it's a very delicate balancing act as to how much freedom we'd all like each entity to have to offer incentives to people to come grow its own economy.
Yeah, look, it's a very good point. I mean, you have, because you have this state-based tax system in the US, you have effectively the same thing, on a national level as what's going on at an international level today. I think, when you talk about grown-ups in the room, I think one part of it is the adequacy and competence of leaderships. But another big problem that you've seen is also that there are obviously a lot of vested interests in the system, and I think one of the issues is that there is clearly a lot of money in politics, whether it's through campaign finance, and a lot of influence from powerful corporations and very wealthy interests. And in the US, you've seen that on top of the influence of a media, and a particular social media universe that's ever made views ever more siloed and partisan. And so these have become very difficult questions to resolve. So I mean, there's a whole host of issues that need to be tackled. But I think very simply, I think that we're at a point where if we don't sit down and act as grown-ups and sort out the problems and at least design a path forward, then we're doomed to repeat a lot of the mistakes of history, which when you've had these extreme imbalances in wealth, income, and in financial markets, have led to pretty catastrophic outcomes, none of which I'm sure any of us want to live through.
No, it would be truly calamitous and violent. Without obviously divulging anything that you couldn't, it was a while ago. So can you tell us a bit about the work you had done as Hong Kong's economy and structure is being integrated more with the mainland? I mean, were there some lessons that you took from that, from what you saw as being kind of part of that front and center that inform your thinking in the book about how to deal with kind of thorny issues? Is that a relevant straight line from that experience to how you wrote?
I certainly learned a lot. So what I was doing at the exchange for a lot of my time there was helping the Chinese capital markets internationalize through Hong Kong. So we created these schemes called the Stock Connect and the Bond Connect schemes, which allowed international investors to more easily trade into China, and for Chinese investors to be able to trade out into Hong Kong. And obviously the system that Hong Kong operates is very similar to the international norms of capital markets. The Chinese capital markets, because they've come from a very different set of origins, they operate in a very different way. And so I mean, I can recount one story, which was probably one of the more embarrassing that I've had professionally ever.
Great, that's what we look for. We all learn from our errors far more than our successes.
So when we were negotiating with the Shanghai Stock Exchange back about how we would implement the first Stock Connect scheme that was done between Hong Kong and mainland China, I was sitting with my opposite number talking about one of the details of implementation, and we disagreed over what should be done. And he asked me why I thought we should do it my way, and I said, well, this is the international norm. This is how it's done everywhere.
Right.
And he turned around and looked at me and said, but why? And there I'd been sitting thinking, getting more and more frustrated, thinking, he just doesn't understand. It wasn't that he didn't understand. He understood perfectly well. He looked at it. He just didn't agree with it. Right. And I couldn't say the same for myself, in that I just taken it as normal international practice, had never questioned why that was the case. And I had no idea how they did it in the domestic market. And I think it taught me a very good lesson, it taught me several very good lessons. One I think was that, I think that there's a tendency with dealing with people where you haven't dealt with those things, or it's unknown, to be very dogmatic and arrogant about them. And I think, as China's risen, it's come from a different place, and they've been very successful in growing their economy and developing their infrastructure. And I think the rest of the world has a lot to learn from that. And I think we should express a level of humility in absorbing those lessons. I think the other thing which you've seen with the shifts in technology, there are a lot of things which happen in capital markets today which happened because they were done that way back 50 years ago. Yep. And 50 years ago, the design entirely made sense because people were shuffling pieces of paper around, between different vaults and so forth. That's created a huge number of jobs. It's created a huge number of iron rice bowls in our financial system, which, if you apply modern processes and technology to them, would no longer exist. Right. And I think that's a fairly salutary lesson to us all, which is that we need to innovate to progress. And as much as we like to think that American capital markets and international capital markets are incredibly efficient, that actually in many cases is not the case anymore. And as we stagnate, then this is dragging down our economic growth potential, which is contributing to some of the drag on improvement in lifestyles that we're seeing.
Absolutely. We had a mutual friend of ours, Patrick Young, and I were having a chat a while ago. He's been leading the vanguard of electronic markets for years now, and it was fascinating because that very topic came up. Right? We discussed what are the things that it would seem obvious to fix in the international capital markets infrastructure. And it's boring stuff like check remittance and transfer to payments, right? You could clear a check between Bruges and Firenze faster in 1450 than you can between New York and Sydney today, right? A paper check, which is nuts, absolutely nuts. Like you could get on a plane from New York, fly to Sydney, and give someone the cash, right? And do that in 24 hours. And so there are inherent sort of problems in speeding up and making those things efficient. But I also remember from a lot of the time in 98, 99, 2000, all that dot-com excitement, and people would come to us at the bank and say, we've got this great new thing that's gonna make everything move really fast, right? And especially I was young then, and that seemed obvious, right? Yeah, we'll make the thing more efficient, that'll be great. But wiser heads also, or people with a different view. So yeah, but you're talking about taking a process that, yeah, we've got a few head count. There are people here that push paper around. But by handling that for our customers, we have a laser eye on their interests. We know where their stuff is at all times. If we hand this over to a third party that's supposed to do this faster, if nothing goes wrong, great, we saved everyone money. If something goes wrong, right? We have lost a customer, they've lost their money, and it came up last night in a discussion I was having with a friend who's traded a lot of crypto, has made a fortune. And someone copied a SIM card, violated the security on his phone by spoofing the SIM card, got in, and he lost hundreds of millions of dollars overnight. Gone, right? So there's a fine example of, yes, it's great that we've got this whole new system that's far more efficient, but it's a double, it's a a fingerprint and a text message and a password, 3-factor authentication. But if they get those three, you're wiped out, and it's like someone took a bag of diamonds from you and flew away. So a lot of those frictions that we see, right? We see it here in the States. You've seen it operating in Hong Kong with exchanges. How much of that kind of delay in speeding things up is due to thoughtful considerations of downsides versus just institutional inertia? Do you have a weighting on that?
I don't think I'm in a position to hazard a guess, but I think that I've certainly seen thoughtful reservations being put forward on the implementation of new technology, particularly around issues like risk management, and that's extremely important. What I've also seen, though, is a host of vested interests weighing in to prevent the adoption of new methods, new processes, and new technology, not for good and sound reasons, but for reasons of self-interest. And there's definitely a balance that needs to be struck between progress and the risk management and mitigation. But I think where we are in the financial markets in a lot of parts of the world today is that I think we've created too much. We've built too much around incumbent vested interests that I think are undermining the integrity of the system.
Yeah, no, that's entirely true. We're seeing it with the kind of fights over what crypto regulation will look like or not look like. And you mentioned something fascinating about that integration between two different systems, and that the mainland Chinese capital system evolved from different bases, different premises. Like, what would you consider to be the most salient difference between the origins of that system and what it means for how it operates today versus, as you said, this is just how the world does it?
That's a really good question. I think one of the points that I make in the book is that although China's been very successful in driving growth over the last 40 years, that they've also hit a point at which they need to fundamentally relook at the underpinnings of their system and to make reforms to allow it to provide growth for the next 40 years. Fundamentally, China came from being dirt poor in the early 80s when it started the reform and opening up process. It was ideologically communist with a huge distrust of capitalists and capital markets. And as these things were adopted to serve the economy and to help drive its growth, the system that was put in place was a far more controlled system than exists in America and elsewhere. And in the early parts of China's economic development, actually, that was a very useful thing. So you had this huge labor force come online, start to save money, put it into banks, etc. And because the state controlled the banking system, the state was able to control the allocation and the pricing of that capital. And the state made some very good decisions around how that capital would be allocated into developing the country's infrastructure, which enabled the country to develop this massive industrial machine that it's got today. The problem with that top-down model is that while it's very effective in the early stages of development, when the economy is less complex and the issues are more obvious in terms of what needs to be built, what needs to be developed, that top-down investment-led model, I don't think today is fit for purpose for the needs of China going forward over the next 40 years. because as the country has aged, China is going to face a huge demographic cliff in terms of aging population and a reduction in the working age population, the total population. You can't go on building your way to grow through increasing your industrial capacity, building more apartment blocks and homes, when you have possibly a shrinking number of people to consume the goods produced and to live in the homes that are built. And so China needs, in my view, to move to a system which allows markets a greater influence in the allocation and pricing of capital. I'm not saying that it should be done blindly. Markets obviously operate within institutional frameworks and the incentive structures that those create, and ultimately the regulatory frameworks and the laws and systems around which they operate need to generate the right incentives to deliver the optimal outcomes for society as a whole. But I think in China's case, we certainly need to see a less of a hand of government directly in the operation of capital markets, and for government to sit back and concentrate on creating the institutions and the rules that allow the markets to operate efficiently.
That's really well put, right? In terms of, I think our listeners would comprehend that pretty readily, right? If you've got a massively poor nation with huge numbers of people, and you don't have much of anything in the way of an economy, you almost can't go wrong, right? I need factories to make steel. I need things that make tubes. I need roads. I need bridges. Like, it's obvious, right? And it's glaringly obvious. Like, I need all this stuff. I need hospitals. I need apartment buildings. I need high-speed trains. But once you've got all that, then the optimal allocation of capital becomes much more important in terms of freewheeling. Thousands of voices voting always get to a better answer than any one person guessing at once, right? So that must be a very hard transition. I mean, we see it here, the New Deal in the US, whether it was a good idea, bad idea, whether FDR prolonged the Depression or not, I can have that fight with friends all day long. But there was a sudden influx of government intervention in the economy. The Works Progress Administration sent men out with shovels to clear roads, and we built highways if Eisenhower came into office, all that stuff. But then once it was done, they never set aside money for maintenance, right? So our infrastructure is crumbling as an embarrassment. And all the other things that come up, no central planner ever sat down and said, in the next 30 years, we're going to have the internet, we're going to have a Walkman, we're going to have things this big that has 78 terabytes of data on it. Like, no one thought of that, and no one can think of that. And so is that a harder transition to make potentially in a one-party state versus a two-party state, or is that an oversimplification of how those dynamics between government and capital decisions get made?
Well, I mean, the Chinese system has the potential to be very efficient because the government can just cut through all of that red tape. Under the US democratic system, where you have these systems of checks and balances, this is much more difficult to do because there's inevitably much more debate. I think the debate is actually in many cases healthy, so long as it is not driven by vested interests. And this is where I think the US system, when you have the level of campaign finance contributions that are passed to the political or elected officials through these mechanisms, the political action committees, etc., the incentives that are created are perverse and undermine the democratic system and its ability to engage in honest and thoughtful debate to drive the best outcomes. And I think that's something where there's clearly a lot of thought and debate going into that in the US today. And I think that it's one of the challenges that the US needs to resolve to bring itself forward?
It's interesting because we spend a lot of time on that very idea, and no system is perfect, right? If you've got Plato's idealistic philosopher king, well, then you're delighted to have a benevolent despot, right? And Ibn Khaldun wrote his great Muqaddimah back in the 15th century. His whole point about the ruler being so much wealthier that lobbyists have no impact, right? I mean, we used to laugh about that with Mike Bloomberg as the mayor of New York. There's nothing anyone could offer him that would sway his opinion, right? But that didn't automatically mean that he made the best decision either, right? So it's a very tough balancing act, because you will also have, even though there's not this, I would guess from my reading of how China's government works, the little I know, there isn't that sort of democratic push and pull and lobbying, but being a political system, being a social system made up of humans, there are vested interests who are putting forward their views, right? So that decision tree can't be free from pedestrian influence any more than the American system can be. It's just structured differently.
You're absolutely right. I mean, no system is perfect, and actually, the Chinese probably have more experience than any other nation in the world with this, because you've seen the Chinese leadership are incredibly conscious of the rises and falls of the different dynasties, and these things are cyclical. You get to the start of a dynasty, and you have good, benevolent rulers and emperors, and everything goes great for a while. Your prosperity increases, people's lives get better. At some point, you get in place leadership which is less able to deal with those issues, or is not interested in dealing with those issues, or have vested interests in certain parts of the system. And generally that's led to a decline and fall of those dynasties. And so this has happened throughout 4 centuries of recorded history in China. It's happened countless times. And I think with regards to the Chinese leadership today, they're very conscious of the flaws in their system. I think each time that they make reforms, that they try and make it a little bit better. But inevitably, there are the same issues with vested interests, and there are many risks in that system too. The one thing that I learned through my research writing this book is that political systems are not fixed in stone, and ultimately they need constant vigilance and constant tending in order to make sure that they continue to serve the needs of society, which are always changing with the evolution of technology, the evolution of social mores, and other things. And I think that one of the things that we need to look at today is whether or not we can improve the systems that we've got. We've certainly, more than any other generation before us, we've got better information and better understanding of what's gone on in the past. And it's amazing to me that many people in positions of authority don't take advantage of the learning that's available to them to improve the system and certainly avoid repeating mistakes that have been made in the past.
Yeah, well, that's a good lament. I love. There's a great book by Kurt Vonnegut, the American author, and it was I forget which book it was, but he had one of his characters say to someone else, it was like right after World War I or II or whatever it was, and he said, "You know what? We got to write all this down so no one ever makes this mistake again." It was so beautifully written. And I think, this is a fascinating conversation. Thank you. But I know your time is precious. But I think what I'd love to ask is the title, well done, good provocative title, right? But the title, Financial Cold War, leads to a very interesting question, right? The denouement of the last Cold War was a flourishing and a changing of regimes within Eastern Europe to some good effect, some not so great effect, but it ended pretty terribly for the Soviet Union, I mean, for Russia itself. And we're seeing a lot of those, one would argue, I would argue, a lot of those resentments from that collapse in status, collapse in economy. We're seeing it play out now with a resurgent sort of hostility between Russia and the West, broadly speaking, America. We would obviously love to not see a ending to this financial Cold War that is deleterious to either side, right? Is there, in your prescription, is there a path forward where everything works better? We all, participate in the global capital economy better, and the stresses and strains diminish without there having to be some horrendous bad event for one or both sides? Do you think that's possible, or is it really going to be something terrible is going to happen and we're all going to look back and wish we hadn't done it?
Look, it's entirely possible and within our control to come to a peaceful resolution and rebalancing of the system. But that ultimately depends on a whole host of individual decisions made by individual leaders. And really, they need now to tread very carefully and to make sure that we don't repeat many of the mistakes that have been made in the past. As you say, the tensions today that you're seeing in Eastern Europe and in the former Soviet bloc derive from the collapse of the Soviet Union. And inevitably, all living together on the same planet, everything that we do is going to have an impact on other places. And that's particularly the case in financial markets, because the world has become so small through the globalization of trade and the globalization of investment. And so we need to be very careful now in making those steps and making sure that in everything that we do, we try to reduce hostilities between countries rather than to elevate tensions between them. And particularly in the public rhetoric that is being bandied around, a lot of that has been rather unconstructive on both sides in the past few years. And I think that, first of all, leaders need to be careful in their public comments, treat each other with a level of respect, and set the right tone from the top.
Well, that is a excellent goal that I would toast to any day of the week. And it'd be good. You look at history, and some people have just been, you look back in hindsight, and we just got lucky. Some people rose to the occasion, right, and were right for the moment and didn't say the stupid thing that set off the next war. And some people take a shot at an archduke in a city parade, and then the world gets engulfed.
And the reason why I wrote the book, and the book, as you said at the start, I mean, there's a lot of great stuff that's been written that's focused on geopolitics, that's focused on financial markets, focused on China. And what I found was that a lot of that, while very good, is really written for a very narrow audience.
Yes.
It's written for the specialists, the policy wonks, etc. And what I was trying to do when I set out to write my book was to write it in a way that the average person could understand and appreciate the importance of the issues, mainly in the hope that they would be able to then go on and be more informed on the debates that their political leaders were having and be better enabled to hold their leaders to account.
Oh, it's an excellent goal. Right? I mean, it is one of the biggest criticisms that I've had, having worked in DC quite a lot and dealt with governments in various levels, usually regulatory affairs around the world, is the inherent desire for vested interests. In this case, I would argue, kind of political power seekers or political rent seekers in regulatory regimes, is to keep everything just the way it is right now, right? Because I understand it and I'm important, and that's okay. That's the part that's not okay. The part that is okay, as I balance that, is there are people who are genuinely concerned that rampant innovation, say we're galloping away with cryptocurrency with no guide rails whatsoever, is going to result in Ponzi schemes and retail investors losing their money, and we'd like to try to prevent that, right? So there's always a mix. Most people are pretty good, well-intentioned. I don't meet a lot of people who go into politics thinking I'm going to wreck the system, right? I mean, the inertia of the system and the obstacles they face in trying to flip the switch on change, I think is very frustrating, especially in the US context, where, as you rightly point out, there are a lot of deliberate sand poured into the gears of our system. And that's a feature, not a bug, right? The Constitution is designed to make it really, really hard to change things fundamentally. Now, one could argue whether that's smart or not, right? And you look at a country example of China, which has done, miraculous things since the 1980s in terms of transitioning a society from one stage of development to another in an incredibly rapid time scale. So it's hard to argue with that result. But it's interesting to see if either of the two systems are going to learn enough, take the time to learn enough from one another to potentially pick the best aspects of both and come to something that works better for us all. I'd love to maintain a degree of optimism that that's possible. So hopefully they'll all read your book and they can sit there and they can argue over the chapters, and then that will be the text. Is that a good goal? You want that sitting on the policymaker's desk?
You cut off for about 10 seconds there, so I missed.
Oh, sorry. My hope is that everyone on both sides of that debate, they will all get copies of your book, and when they're discussing issues related to how they need to negotiate things, they're going to say, "Well, I mean, as James says in chapter 6, let's do that." Is that a goal? Would that be great?
I hope that my book's able to make a small contribution.
I have faith. Any last thoughts? Or, I'm telling my listeners, of course, to go get a copy of the book and read it assiduously, and they'll probably send me questions I'll pass to you. But are there any sort of main highlights or main points you'd like to leave us with?
The only one that I will leave with everyone is that there's, for China and America today are so intertwined through trade, through investment. They're so intertwined in terms of their mutual dependence on having a sustainable planet to live on, that there's no option but to work together. And it's each in our mutual self-interest to see the other do well socially and economically. And so I hope that, that this book will help people understand that better, and that will ultimately have an influence on political leaders and the important decisions that they have to take in the months and years ahead. Excellent. Well, I hope that goal becomes a reality for everyone, and appreciate your time with us today. Looking forward to speaking to you again. And for my listeners, as we always say, do yourself a favor, turn off the mainstream media. They are lying to you daily, and tune into Messy Times. I would add to that in this instance, as you're tuning into Messy Times, pop over to your bookseller and get a copy of Financial Cold War, A View of Sino-US Relations from the Financial Markets. James, thanks so much. Appreciate it. Enjoy your day in Hong Kong. Thank you very much, Chris. Appreciate it. Cheers.